my side. Couldn't get anything to work, but now everything seems to be working, including my arms and legs. So all seems to be good. I'm just going to jump in and introduce our speaker, Professor Dylan Footer, or Butter. Sorry, I'm trying to. It is not a good day for me. Cannot open anything. All right, here we are. Okay, so Professor Dylan Footer from WITS, Associate Professor in Philosophy at the University of the Witwatersrand, WITS, where he is coordinator of the Applied Ethics for Professionals program. His research is primarily in ethics and ancient Greek philosophy. He is published in many local and international journals. His book manuscript, Socrates' Search for Wisdom, is contracted by Routledge and is currently under review. And today he's going to be speaking to us about Socrates on learning to be good. Please take it away.
Thanks very much, Ashil. Good morning, everyone. I thank you for inviting me to give this talk. And let me get down to business. I have prepared something of a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to be talking through. So let me share my screen. Let me begin by giving you a sense of what this paper is about. As you will know already, the paper concerns Socrates' method of education, Socrates as a teacher. Maybe more specifically, Socrates' his concern with the education of people in ethical dimensions. Socrates is a teacher of virtue, and what that will turn out to mean, as will become clear through the course of this paper, is Socrates' concern to develop wisdom in his interlocutors. Now, I should say that my own interest in this topic is not merely theoretical, where one might mean by that something like, my interest is not particularly having a theory of wisdom, but with the actual attempt to become wiser. And clearly this practical dimension to the practice of philosophy is quite central to what Socrates is up to in his, I guess, his life's mission. Now, wisdom is, of course, you might disagree with this, but it seems pretty obviously true to me, the most important virtue for one to cultivate. And this, of course, leads us into the question of what wisdom might be. So there's a sense in which this paper is less concerned with Socrates and more concerned with the nature of wisdom. I should also indicate that the way in which I'm going to present this material is abstracted from the text to a significant degree. So I'm not really going to be taking you through Platonic dialogues. Some of you might be disappointed by that, others may be somewhat relieved. One reason for proceeding in the way that I am is, I guess, the focus on the text sometimes gets in the way of understanding what is being said. So the paper turns out to be something like a paper in the history of philosophy, which is concerned to present some kind of interpretation of what Socrates may or may not have been up to. If you're interested in the relationship between Plato and Socrates, you can ask me about that in the question and answer. So what I've done then is I've tried to abstract completely, or not completely, but as much as I could from the actual, the details of Plato's texts in order to focus on what I take to be the central dimensions of philosophical interest to us. It will turn out that in thinking about the way in which Socrates teaches, we have to keep our eye on two things at once. On the one hand, we need to focus on something like the conceptual movements of the argument, if one wants to call it that. I think there's reason for thinking that it's not an argument and should better be characterized as an inquiry. So one needs to keep one's eye on the movements of the inquiry, as well as the way in which an inquiry of this sort in fact, affects the character and perhaps more accurately, and maybe more bewilderingly for some of you, the soul of the interlocutor. So it's as if Socrates is doing two things at once. He's trying to guide the interlocutor to deeper levels of insight into the nature of virtue, while at the same time modifying his capacity to know. So let me not prejudice my own argument by giving you a summary of exactly what I'm going to say today, but let me move on now to a couple of remarks which I thought I would include, because if you're not familiar with the writings of Plato, and if you're not familiar with ancient Greek philosophy, some of these points might strike you as strange. Perhaps they are in fact strange, but I guess I'm going to be alerting you to their strangeness, and I'm happy to discuss these points in more detail later. I'm not going to try to defend them at the outset. So the first point would just be this: I'm going to be using the word soul, and I'm going to be using the word soul as a translation of the Greek word psyche. I think it is the best English translation that I'm able to come up with. As for the ontological significance of the term, I'll leave that aside for now. Secondly, I'm going to use the word spiritual, and spiritual refer to what you might say is the soul as a whole. The spiritual improvement would then include things like intellectual, emotional, desiderative improvement. In a sense, the soul just is the psyche, or the agent as a whole, and whatever faculties comprise the agent are then spiritual faculties in my use of that term. Thirdly, Plato thinks, I don't think this is very controversial, that knowledge is a power of the soul. Of course, this doesn't explicate the nature of knowledge, but I think puts it into a category of things. It gives it a certain ontology, and that ontology presumably constrains our understanding of its nature. And then finally, I thought I would point out that much of my discussion is going to be framed in terms of visual metaphors. In other words, I'm going to liken the mind, the soul, to the eye. And this is certainly in keeping with the way in which Socrates and Plato describe the soul, describe our ethical powers, if you want to use that term. It may be problematic in certain ways, but I thought that I should alert you to the fact that this is deliberate. We could ask the question, what sorts of metaphors do we use to describe ethical development? And that would perhaps be a worthwhile question, but it's certainly not my question for this morning, unless someone wants to talk more about it later. So with these preliminaries stated, let me get down to the business of argument or inquiry, and try to lay out the main ideas that I'm wanting to focus on in this morning's presentation. So my basic idea is really this. I don't think it's really my idea. I think this is what Plato is trying to get us to think. So it's my idea about what Plato is up to. So I think we should approach this question of what wisdom is, which I take to be the primary question that I'm concerned to elucidate, even if its significance will become clearer only a little bit later. But my strategy is then to try to elucidate the nature of wisdom by considering people who aren't wise. And this will be to consider the Socratic Interlocutors, since guess what we have in the Platonic dialogues is the representation of a wise person, namely Socrates. Of course, paradoxically wise, in as much as his wisdom consists in his recognition of his distance from the ideal. So we have a representation of a conversation between a sage and someone who is presumably less than that, and typically someone who considers himself, the interlocutors are in Plato, or at least these interlocutors that I'm referring to today are male. So I'm going to be using the masculine pronoun when I'm referring to specific interlocutors. So now this interlocutor is typically someone who thinks that he does know how to live. someone who thinks that he knows what virtue is, what it would mean to respond appropriately in life. Now, in Plato, I think that it's sometimes useful, and I will be drawing a distinction between two kinds of interlocutors. The first one we might call the intuitive interlocutor. The second is the sophisticated interlocutor, where sophisticated obviously connects up with the word sophistic. And there is a relation here, which I'll perhaps mention a little bit later. But I want to begin with the intuitive interlocutor. And I want to describe some of the weaknesses, the ethical defects that I think Plato is trying to draw to our attention. And then also try to describe how Socrates goes about attempting to develop this person, where I think we will get a clearer apprehension of the nature of virtue and also the relationship between virtue and wisdom through our paying attention to the mechanics of Socrates's moral education. So when we recognize what Socrates is trying to do in sort of adjusting and developing the intuitive interlocutor, we'll get a clearer sense of what wisdom would have to be. Now, it seems to me that the problem with the intuitive interlocutor is pretty much this. He has a partial understanding, or maybe a lopsided understanding of virtue. What that means, I will come back to in a moment. Secondly, he doesn't know it. So the intuitive interlocutor thinks that he sees the world as it is, the ethical world. So he sort of believes that he recognizes what is important, what is admirable, and its opposite. But his focus is in some sense distorted, and he doesn't know that at all. So with these two features in mind, I think we can, make sense of a lot of the way in which Socrates proceeds in his dialogue, understanding that dialogue as an attempt to educate this person in relation to virtue. So what do I mean when I say that this interlocutor's understanding of virtue is lopsided or partial? Well, something like this. So don't worry, I haven't put up my whole presentation on the PowerPoint slide. So now I'm going to be actually just talking from some notes. So the partiality of the interlocutor's understanding or conception of virtue. So I'm wanting to introduce this idea of a conception of virtue as a technical term. Let me get to that in a second. The partiality of the interlocutor's understanding it has to do with something like a concentration on specific value or virtue to the exclusion of others. So maybe this interlocutor thinks about the good, the human good, in terms of, say, justice. And to the extent that he does so, he forgets about the role of maybe courage, moderation, and even wisdom in a satisfactory understanding of the ethical realm. So there's a sense in which the concentration on one part is a dislocation of the interlocutor from other parts. And hence it brings about a failure to properly attend to the respective contributions of those other parts of virtue to a holistic understanding of the ethical world. So on one hand, the interlocutor often prioritizes one virtue. So Laches, he thinks, well, courage is really the most important virtue. Other interlocutors think something similar of justice, and we can refer to additional examples. Furthermore, but even when we're focusing on an interlocutor who prioritizes one virtue amongst many, there's a further dimension of partiality in the way that the interlocutor actually thinks about their favored virtue. What this normally amounts to is something like a focus on certain paradigmatic aspects to the exclusion of non-paradigm instances. So to give you a specific example, Laches is an Athenian general. He thinks about ethics in terms of courage, but he also thinks about courage in terms of war. So for him, the epitome of courage is being able to stand your ground in a hoplite battle. So to this extent, his concentration on courage, distracts him, or his concentration on courage of the hoplite distracts him from other forms of courage, moral courage, the courage of standing up for justice, perhaps, in the assembly. So once again, we have, I think, the similar pattern being replicated at the level of specific virtues. A concentration on one aspect of the virtue distracts the interlocutor from other aspects. Now, what does this concentration or organization or maybe centering of the interlocutor's ethical attention on a specific virtue or a specific aspect of virtue actually consist in? Roughly speaking, what I would want to say is this: it consists in something like what you tend to notice and what you don't notice, what you get angry about and don't get angry about, what you feel fearful about and what you don't, what you aim for, what you aspire towards, the way in which you reason, so the weight that you place on certain kinds of considerations as opposed to others in thinking about, I guess, how to live. And furthermore, it also seems to include the elements of action, since people who don't concentrate on certain aspects of virtue tend not to be very good at handling situations in which those aspects are salient. So like he's pretty good when it comes to standing his ground in a war, but is he good in the assembly when he has to stand up, against his peers and say, no, this is not the right form of action. We shouldn't be undertaking this policy. Not so much. His concentration on a specific form of courage almost prevents him from developing the requisite potential for responding well in other dimensions of life, where those other dimensions of life have to do with and require the exhibition of courage. All right, so two further points before moving into the details of Socrates' method of education. The first point would be, a conception of virtue, in my sense, then refers to it's sort of a configuration of the soul, configuration of the psyche. So one's conception of virtue isn't only cognitive or doxastic, it actually refers to the way in which your emotions and desires and aspirations are configured in relation to your understanding. So your conception of virtue can be exhibited in what you get angry about, even if there's a discrepancy between what you get angry about and what you think about yourself. Furthermore, it seems pretty obvious that if you have a partial conception of virtue, so your emotions are focused on certain kinds of things and they miss other things on account of their the orientation, then you're going to have a life which is pretty much like our lives. When I say our lives, I mean sort of ordinary people like us, I assume. Lives that are partly good and partly bad. So we'll get things right some of the time, but not all of the time. And part of the reason why we get things right to some extent, but not more reliably, is because of the sort of partiality of our ethical vision. Furthermore, I suppose it's worthwhile noting that, the person who has a partial conception of virtue is then, in some sense, failing to live up to their own ideals. So, Laches is a general. He thinks, courage is the most important thing. But the way he thinks about courage actually prevents him from being courageous. So, because of his myopic view of courage, he just doesn't exhibit courage in all kinds of circumstances. So the partiality of his ethical understanding actually kind of defeats his own goals. And I think this point is somewhat significant in understanding how Socrates' method of education works. And I think it fundamentally aims to reveal to people that they're not living up to their own ideals. So that's why if the dialogue works reasonably well, and they don't normally work that well, but in as much as it works reasonably well, what you should have is sort of a discrepancy that comes to be recognized by the interlocutor, where that discrepancy is between a specific conception of himself and a specific recognition of his failure to measure up to it. All right, so much for, I guess, the second round of preliminaries. What I'm going to talk about now is how Socrates actually teaches. So in what way does he, or in what means does he use to develop the ethical powers of the interlocutor? And as I mentioned at the outset of my talk, when reading Plato, you have to focus on two things at once. You have to focus on, firstly, I guess, the word, the concept, the idea. What is the sort of, how does the conceptual movement of the dialogue work? But you can't only focus on that. You also have to focus on what's sometimes described as the deed or the act or the response. So, maybe Socrates presents an argument for a specific conclusion, but you need to not only pay attention to that, you also have to pay attention to the question of how the presentation of that argument is meant to, what kinds of responses, what kinds of ethical responses it's meant to elicit from the interlocutor, and how succeeding arguments can be seen to sort of develop and activate different forms of ethical awareness. So, so Socrates is not only concerned with propositional argumentation, if he is in fact concerned with that at all. He's concerned with the way in which those ideas are received and interpreted, and the way in which those interpretations themselves can be used by the interlocutor to sort of refashion himself in relation to a clearer apprehension of what virtue is. So what I'm going to talk about now is the conceptual level of dialogue. So, how does the arguments run? And I'm just going to say a few things about this quite quickly. So as mentioned, I'm not going to be giving you very many details. I'm just going to try and reduce the conceptual movements of the dialogue to its bare bones. So what does Socrates do? I mean, how does he proceed? I mean, as everyone knows, he asks a definitional question. So his question is something like this. He says, hey, interlocutor, I can see that you put yourself forward as a good person. I see that you put yourself forward as a person of virtue. So could you please tell me how you think of virtue? I mean, what do you, as someone who puts yourself forward as knowing how to live, how do you elaborate and explain what virtue is? Now, what happens is, of course, since the interlocutor is partial in understanding, what he does is he appeals to those dimensions of virtue which are salient to him and which constitute his very partiality. He often defines virtue in terms of some specific example. So maybe Laches says, courage is being able to stand your ground in war. That's not the only example. Maybe Euthyphro says, oh yeah, I mean, justice is really, prosecuting people who have done wrong. And I think we can refer to similar sort of paradigmatic conceptualizations of the virtue in almost every Platonic dialogue. So what does Socrates do in response to this? In response to this account of what virtue is, which exhibits the partiality of the interlocutor's understanding, which exhibits, I guess, nothing other than what they concentrate on and what they leave out, what they fail to properly register in life. He presents an objection. Excuse me, I had something of a cold. I know that it's not COVID, but give me 1 sec, please. Socrates presents something of you might describe it as a logical objection, but I think that's problematic because these answers that are given by the interlocutors, they aren't, I guess, logical answers in the sense that, I mean, the discussion isn't logical because what we're talking about is how someone thinks, how they live. We're not engaged in an epistemology seminar where you just have a bunch of theories and you're trying to work out the best theory. What these interlocutors are trying to speak is, I guess, their existential priorities. So what Socrates says is, okay, well, I mean, not what you're saying is reasonable, but I mean, surely you have to agree that there are other ways of exhibiting this virtue. And what does he do then? He tries to draw attention to things that the interlocutor didn't refer to in presenting the paradigmatic answer that he did. So these are things that just don't occupy the center of the interlocutor's attention. And so what Socrates is then doing is he's sort of generalizing the interlocutor's thinking. He's saying something like, okay, well, what you're saying is you've answered in some sense partially correctly, because you pointed to something that is often an instance of the relevant virtue. But I mean, surely you would admit that virtue can be displayed in almost every action. Surely you would admit that virtue isn't actually to be found in action, but rather to be found in the agent's orientation to, specific circumstances. So you're not going to find the nature of courage by saying, oh, okay, well, standing your ground in war. Just because, for example, one needs to recognize that you can exhibit courage outside of war. You can exhibit courage in response to almost every circumstance in life. And you can exhibit courage in response to almost every thought and feeling that you experience. So what Socrates is then essentially trying to do, in my opinion, is he's trying to drive the interlocutor inwards. He shouldn't think about virtue in terms of sort of externals, in terms of actions. He should think about virtue in terms of his own responses. And this movement, this ploy on the part of Socrates is usually quite successful. And the interlocutor always accepts his point and says, okay, well, I guess you're right about that. There are other ways of exhibiting virtue. And Socrates says, okay, well, do you want to maybe try again? Give me a more general account, one that encompasses all the different forms of virtue, not just the ones that you are concentrating on. and what the interlocutor then does is this. He suggests that virtue must be some kind of quality of will. Now, I'm putting the point in slightly anachronistic language, but I don't think it matters much. So, for example, Laki says, well, courage is about being able to endure when facing trials. Euthyphro says, piety is it's kind of about justice. It's about being obedient to the gods. So the disposition of obedience is what's important in thinking about piety and hence justice. Polemachus in the first book of the Republic says, justice is really, should be understood in terms of respecting people's rights. It's not about specific kind of action, always telling the truth or always sort of paying your debts. It's rather about sort of the underlying concepts of the idea of rights. So this is movement of maybe towards the notion of respecting other people as agents, or basically Kantian ethics, which I would say gets dismissed by Plato in a single sentence or two in the Republic. Now to this definition, the second definition, which adverts to quality of will, Socrates presents the basic objection, which is actually a Kantian objection. He says, yeah, okay, fair enough. But surely you would agree that sometimes it's bad to endure. If you're enduring in bad ends, then it might be worse to endure than not to endure. Okay, by obeying the law, that sounds reasonable, but surely you admit that. If you're talking about obeying a police officer who's gone crazy, maybe that isn't really the just thing to do. So it just points to the fact that will only can't get you an ethical response, because the exemplification of the act of will just sometimes seems like the wrong thing to do. Sometimes seems to be bad. The assumption here is that virtue is not bad. Virtue has to be manifest in actions which are always good. So this moves then to the third definition, and this is where things get really quite difficult. Maybe not right now, but I think they'll become quite difficult for me in a few minutes. What Socrates suggests is pretty much this. He says, okay, well, maybe we could fix your definition by incorporating something like an element of knowledge. And maybe what's missing is a reliable connection between a specific attitude or a specific form of will and what is actually appropriate in the circumstance. So maybe virtue is then something like having that quality of will in combination with the knowledge of when to exercise that will and when not to. So I guess that in some sense bypasses the need for will. we could perhaps re-examine that inference. And I don't mean to actually be attributing it to Socrates now. That's maybe an interesting question as to whether that is the way the argument proceeds. But the basic idea is then that like virtue must involve a kind of knowledge, because knowledge is a way of reliably acting according to the demands of the circumstance. So we seem to have made a certain kind of progress. Do we make much more progress? Well, here's what I can say about that. So the suggestion is that someone of virtue would know when to exhibit a specific quality of will. They would know when to endure, when not to endure, know when to obey the law, know when to break the law. And Socrates then encourages the interlocutor to sort of reflect upon the nature of the knowledge, which would be able to secure this reliable connection between maybe volition and circumstance. And at this point, the interlocutor struggles. He doesn't ever enumerate or articulate the nature of this knowledge. I mean, I would have to say somewhat that's unsurprising given how difficult this is. But I mean, what he tends to do is the following. He uses familiar branches of knowledge in order to think about knowledge. In other words, he'll refer to maybe science or medicine or craft knowledge, say like knowing how to make shoes. So he'll use these sort of paradigms of knowledge, and he'll say, okay, well, maybe ethical knowledge has a structure akin to these other instances of knowledge, which are normally recognized within the community. So there's no doubt that like some people in the community know how to make shoes and some people know how to make houses. The trouble is that all of these attempts to conceptualize the nature of ethical knowledge fail. They fail for a number of reasons and in quite interesting ways, but I want to set aside that question for today. So in the end, then, what happens is that the interlocutor gets to the point of aporia. But aporia is understood as the recognition that he can't articulate something like his conception of virtue. And more narrowly, he can't articulate his understanding of what virtue is. Because he normally feels that he still has this understanding. He doesn't think that he's completely clueless about how to act. So I find it quite puzzling that he just can't seem to formulate what he feels himself to know. So let me move on now. I probably will return to the idea of aporia because it will have significance later in terms of thinking about how we should act in response to it, and whether ways of responding to aporia might themselves not provide avenues for understanding moral progress. So my next question is this. Ashil, please, if you could just give me a sense of, how I am doing for time, I'd be grateful. All right. Well, at some point, if you could give me a sense of how long I have, is it possibly an hour? But that's what I'll aim for.
Sorry, could you hear me there?
No, I didn't.
Sorry, it was about 10 minutes. We can push in 15 minutes.
Okay, great. So could I end at say 12:15?
That's fine. Yes.
Okay, great. So what I'm doing now is I'm talking about the spiritual level of the dialogue. So not concepts, arguments, but I guess movements of psyche, movements of soul, responses to arguments that exhibit a form of development, not necessarily development, but since I think that Socrates does make some progress here, I think I'll be focusing on the development that I believe does occur. But no, I guess a lot of this will seem it might even seem silly. So maybe if it does, my apologies, but I'm trying to reduce things to a very fundamental and intuitive level. So we're talking about intuitive interlocutors. So we're not talking about people who have philosophical theories in the mind. Those are the sophisticated interlocutors, of whom I'll say something briefly later. So I mean, what is Socrates doing here? I mean, on the one hand, is a very elementary point. He is, I would suggest, appealing throughout to what we might describe as a knowing part of the soul. You could say he's appealing to the interlocutor's reason, but I think this is maybe dangerous because reason is a term that's maybe used a little bit too much, and it's not quite clear that we quite know what we're talking about. So I'm wanting to maybe use sort of slightly different term in order to draw attention to slightly different things than what you might think about when you think about reason. So the suggestion here is that the dialogue proceeds by engaging the interlocutor not at the level of, say, emotion or desire, or even by means of, say, reprimand or approach, but at a conceptual level that resonates and makes demands on the knowing powers, the epistemic powers. They're not fully developed. Well, one of the goals of the dialogue is to develop them further. But demands are being made on the epistemic powers of the agents. Remember that all of these conceptions that the agent has offered for consideration by Socrates are not purely intellectual. They are very much part of how he lives. So in as much as Socrates is going to be affecting these intellectual conceptions, if you want to call them that, he ought to be capable of bringing about changes in the way the interlocutor thinks, and then therefore hopefully in the way that he lives. So I guess the first movement that we might draw attention to is really this power of surveying and generalizing. Remember, the interlocutor's problem was, well, he had a partial conception of virtue, so he just tended to concentrate on certain things. Socrates, in demanding that he answer the question of virtue in its full generality, essentially requires him to take a step back from that, to distance himself from his partial understanding. Furthermore, he seems to require that he actually engage in a kind of surveying of the ethical domain. So, all right, you always think about courage in terms of war, but what about these situations in the family? What about these situations of sort of ethical courage? He's making certain demands on him, on his sort of his, I don't know, epistemic powers. So you've got to detach yourself from what you focus on. You've got to survey other instances of the virtue. And you've also got to try to generalize the account in a way. So you've got to try to find a principle of virtue which isn't partial. Now, without going into great detail over here, I'm not sure that I would be able to go into great detail. The suggestion is that Socrates is actually in the business of actualizing the interlocutor's rational powers, and to exercise the power through the demand to generalize and survey and to distance oneself from oneself, namely one's ordinary point of view, actually brings about a certain development in one's capacity to think. This is, I guess, a very intuitive and sort of simplistic point. So, if you practice arithmetic, you become more arithmetic. Your power over arithmetic is in some sense improved. I think in the end, this notion of actuality is going to be quite important and quite deep. And I think if we want to understand Aristotelian ethics, specifically maybe Aristotelian ethics in response to Socratic ethics, the idea of actuality will really have to be placed right at the center. Secondly, all right, so I'm going to depart slightly from the numbers I presented over here. And maybe I'll move more quickly. What Socrates is also aiming to do then is, of course, to decenter the interlocutor from the paradigm. And furthermore, to bring about an increase in self-reflexivity. So the interlocutor he's being asked to move away from the question of action, paradigmatic context in which virtue is exhibited, and to focus more carefully on, I guess, qualities of will. So in bringing about that change in focus, what Socrates seems to be doing is he's getting the interlocutor to sort of avert his gaze, his mind, from the outside world onto the question of the organization of himself. In a way, we might say that what Socrates is aiming to do is to get the interlocutor to take responsibility for the organization of himself. And if he is to do so, that will provide, I think, an important ingredient in the articulation of what Socrates means by wisdom. Furthermore, Socrates also seems to be trying to recenter the interlocutor. And this is I don't know, it's either a very simple point or a difficult point, but maybe the simple things are the most difficult. Something like this. So originally, the interlocutor's attention, his ethical attention, was focused on a specific kind of domain of action, a specific context. Now we have this movement inwards, this sort of attention of the self onto the self. Furthermore, we have this idea of aporia. Aporia is the self's recognition that it itself cannot know the knowledge that it agrees and recognizes to be essential to virtue. Now, what does that recentering involve? It involves nothing other than something like the philosophical impulse. The interlocutor has made the Socrates has made the interlocutor frustrated at his inability to know something about himself. But in this frustration, he has, in a way, recentered his attention. No longer is he concentrating on war, now he's focused on knowledge. Not only knowledge in general, but the knowledge inherent in virtue, where the knowledge inherent in virtue would presumably be nothing other than practical wisdom. So I want to suggest that this is actually quite a significant kind of progress that has been made, a recentering of the agent's attention onto, I guess, the very idea of getting things right ethically. Now, there is potentially a problem here, and maybe identifying this problem. I mean, there's several problems, but let me begin with the following one. One of the things that we know about this interlocutor is that his rational powers are deformed. So what Socrates is apparently asking him to do is this. He must concentrate his attention on himself. He must concentrate his knowing power on his own knowing power in order to know the nature of that knowing power. But the trouble is that his knowing power isn't fully formed as a power. On account of not being fully formed as a power, there's a sense in which it cannot properly be known. This is a little bit like using a broken camera in order to take a photograph of a camera. So it seems then clear that you can't use a malformed power of knowledge to know the power of knowledge. You can't use a malformed ethical awareness to know the nature of ethical awareness. This would then suggest that the only way you can make progress is if you improve your ethical awareness, form better your power of knowing. And if you're able to do this, then I guess the nature of wisdom will become clearer to you, not intellectually only, but actually as a state of your being. Your intellectual understanding of wisdom, so to speak, will itself develop as your wisdom increases. All right, so I have about 5 minutes left, and I guess the remainder of the talk is meant to be sort of aperitic. Now, I mean, the reason why it's aperitic is partly because I don't have a very good grip of what to say here, but I'm going to tell you what I have and give you a sense of progress, or you might want to disagree with that, the possible progress that I've made in thinking about wisdom, given the models of understanding that have been presented. Now, abstracting quite significantly from the details of many dialogues, what happens next? Often what happens next is that the the sophisticated interlocutor makes an appearance. This is someone who has a theory, someone who has a theory of what virtue is. Turns out, after Socrates scrutinizes this person's opinions, that the theory that they have, which is a theory about the nature of wisdom. So remember, I mean, the intuitive interlocutor got stuck. He was like, I see that, I see that virtue requires wisdom, a certain kind of knowledge, but I just can't seem to articulate it. Then the sophisticated interlocutor makes an appearance and says, okay, well, maybe I can help you over here. And normally has a lot to say. And often he tries to impress people with his sort of sophisticated theories. But when Socrates boils down to essentials, what the sophisticated interlocutor's opinion seems to amount to is something like this. Wisdom is knowledge of the good. Wisdom is knowledge of the useful or the beneficial. Now, this is, of course, comical in a way. And I think Socrates does a pretty good job of showing why it's comical. I mean, it's comical partly because, we have these people who pretend to be wise with many apparently erudite theories, presenting something that boils down to a claim that seems so simplistic and also unhelpful in advancing our understanding. What Socrates' objection really amounts to is this. So, okay, go on. Oh, great, thank you. Wisdom is knowledge of the good. But I mean, isn't good an incomplete predicate? I mean, good for what? Isn't good relative to a specific sort of being? I mean, surely you don't mean knowledge, wisdom is knowledge of the good for a plant or a virus. Presumably you mean something like, wisdom is knowledge of the human good. But isn't the human good virtue? Isn't that an important component in the human good? So it would seem like, wisdom is knowledge of virtue, but haven't we already said that virtue requires wisdom? So knowledge of the good seems to involve knowledge of wisdom. Okay, you're a wretch, Critias or Nicias, whoever you are. You've been leading us in a circle. All these theories you put forward ultimately get us nowhere. Just return us to this question of, well, what is wisdom? Now, so much for how the dialogue ends when, I guess, thinking about its aphoretic dimension. I now have a couple of points that I would like to introduce. I'm not going to be able to explain them properly, but I can at least give you a sense of my thinking. And I have to admit, it seems quite unsatisfactory. So in 2 minutes, the way it goes like this is as follows. Think about what the interlocutor's original disorientation consisted in. It consisted in something like a partiality of vision. So wouldn't we be able to make progress if we were in our wisdom? If we were to, in some sense, consciously adopt the goal of counteracting partiality of vision. So to know the nature of wisdom over here, it wouldn't be to look at, say, ethical crisis points, like how do you handle difficult moral dilemmas? It would begin to look at very small things in the way that you think. And furthermore, it would concentrate on the way in which, I suppose, specific desires and emotions in particular themselves constitute forms of disorientation. So, when one feels anger, what one is doing is one's focusing on a specific aspect of the ethical domain and enlarging it. To feel angry at someone is to prioritize certain sorts of considerations. To this extent, anger is, one might say, incompatible with wisdom, since wisdom requires nothing other than a keen sense of the other considerations that anger itself does not permit to be fully recognized. So the suggestion then is that the philosophical activity of, in some sense, refashioning one's thoughts, feelings, desires is the obvious step that needs to be taken by the interlocutor in the development of wisdom. How does this relate to the question of crisis points? I think I'll probably have to end the paper over here, and I'll say the following. I think it works like this in regard to Socrates. Socrates spent his whole life thinking about small features of his own ethical constitution. So he spends his life in dialogue, concentrating on the way in which desires, feelings, and aspirations potentially distort the way he thinks. So his whole life is, in some sense, a kind of practice of getting oneself into a proper harmony. But what this means is that when the points of crisis actually come about, so for example, Socrates has to stand up against injustice in the courtroom, there's a sense in which he is able to do that nothing other on the count of nothing other than his capacity to see the whole, where that capacity to see the whole is nothing other than the proper apportionment of his desires, emotions, and sensibilities. So Socrates has a kind of clarity of insight, not because he has some kind of theory or theoretical knowledge, but rather because of the way in which he has brought his soul into line with the idea of seeing things correctly. And that is, I think, where I should end today's talk. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dylan. That was very enjoyable, very, very interesting. Beli Matova applauds you. We're going to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes with student questions. Thank you, Clarice, for your applause. So students, undergraduate, postgraduate, please ask your questions or give your comments. You can use your microphone if you'd like, and it might be best if we hear your voice. You can play the role of Socrates, and our speaker can play the role of the intuitive interlocutor, and if he's feeling fancy, he can play the sophisticated interlocutor and annoy us with his wisdom is knowledge of the good. They're fighting amongst each other, and they're just dashing for that button so they can be the one to ask you a question.
Can I go?
Well,
Shanae, you may go. Yes.
Yeah, it's something that I was thinking about towards the beginning of the talk, when you were speaking about the development of different virtues and how it's a partial knowledge thing as people develop things in line with their sort of what they value. So men going to war might think of courage as going to war. But my question is, wouldn't a wise person, and I think you've answered this in your talk, is wouldn't a wise person seek to develop all those virtues if they were truly wise?
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's an interesting question, an interesting, a difficult question. I think, in a certain sense, you are correct, but maybe, if one follows the conceptual movement of the argument, I think the suggestion is that, in a way, all the virtues are forms of practical wisdom. So we start out with, and this is explicitly what Aristotle says. Firstly, it's explicitly what Aristotle, I'm speaking somewhat roughly, but as an approximation, this isn't bad. Aristotle firstly says that for Socrates, all the virtues are forms of knowledge. So Socrates is then committed to something like the unity of the virtues. You strictly speaking can't possess one virtue without possessing all of them. Furthermore, Aristotle himself accepts something like this view. He says, well, I think Socrates overdid it a little bit, but I mean, ultimately he is correct that you can't have virtue in a proper sense without practical wisdom. Why so? Because I guess you need that sensitivity. So ordinarily, and maybe the Aristotelian framework would be helpful over here. Let's think about courage. Courage is defined in relation to fear. Think about maybe moderation. Moderation is defined in relation to desires of a certain sort, maybe desires for sex or pleasure. But the trouble is that as soon as you're focusing only on the emotions or on the desires, you're not going to be able to spell out what we might describe as the sensitivity necessary for contextually getting things right if you restrict your attention only to those desires or emotions. At some point, your fear is going to be inappropriate. At some point, you're going to have to, I guess, either sometimes you should feel fear, and sometimes you shouldn't. Sometimes you should feel fear and say, okay, fear is actually correct here, and the courageous response is in some sense to give into it. So this is maybe a long-winded response to your question, but the answer is that, I mean, if you do accept this basic argument, which is, well, ultimately knowledge is required to give you the correct response. Knowledge of how to relate the situation to your emotion or fear. And that then suggests that the sort of distinction between different virtues pretty much collapses. Because, should you eat too much or should you have sex with every second person you see? Well, I mean, ultimately it's going to be a judgment of wisdom that's going to determine that. The judgment of wisdom is going to determine those questions as well as questions about whether you should fight in a war or stand up for justice in the courtroom. So wisdom is going to kind of have the job of settling all of these different questions, which we ordinarily allocate to different domains and different virtues. But this just suggests that wisdom is itself the only virtue.
Thank you. Anyone else? Shanae, was that a satisfactory reply?
Yes, thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear that. It's not something I hear very often. I'm going to switch my power on. Give me 1 sec.
Chad, I see your question. We'll wait for this for our students to give us more comments or questions. Noma Swazi, I see you there. Clarice, I see you there.
Yeah, I guess I've come to think that one can take this as a sign of a terrible talk or a good talk, and so.
No, it's Zoom. They're hiding behind their
okay, yeah.
Their
either way,
rectangles.
I'm cool with it. So.
Yeah, if it were a real room, we'd thrust a mic into them and like take it and say something, but we can't do that here. So.
Yeah, sort of. The absence of tables for thumping and.
Yes. And luckily, tomatoes for throwing. Jokes, just joking. There is a question. I think I'm going to go with, we're going to open the floor to everyone. So everyone can ask a question, student or not. I'm going to go with Chad's question first because it's in the chat box. Actually, I'm going to go with Nomaswazi first because I say so. Thank you for the talk. It was a great talk. At the moment, I do not have a question to ask, though. Very wide smiley face and a thumbs up. There we go.
Thank
Comment.
you.
And Chad, your question. Regarding the 6 steps involved in teaching the intuitive interlocutor, is anamnesis a necessary background assumption? The steps only seem to work if you assume the interlocutor already knows the correct answer, but is foregrounding specific aspects of the answer. What happens when the interlocutor is genuinely lacking knowledge? Take that, speaker.
Thank you. Yeah, that's kind of offside. So as the referee, I think you should intervene at this point. in the discussion. No,
I do
Chad,
have a
thank
response to that actually, but you can go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so firstly, Chad, yeah, I appreciate that question. It's a difficult one. I was wanting to say something along these lines. In my talk, I didn't quite get to it. So let me begin with a little bit of dogmatism, and it's quite unsocratic, but one has to work with what one has. The doctrine of anamnesis is just one of a series of doctrines. I would call them stories. I would actually even go further than that and call them myths. So we have the myth of recollection. Also, maybe the metaphor of the midwife in the Theaetetus. We also have a myth of something like the soul's pre-carnate vision of the forms in the Phaedrus. Now, what's crucial here is that Plato thinks that, in order to recognize that your ideals are faulty, you have to, in some sense, have knowledge of the ideal. Now, that doesn't imply that you have complete knowledge of the ideal. So, in other words, you don't have to, have a fully actualized understanding of justice in order to know that your current understanding of justice is incomplete. Where Socrates is, of course, trying to get the interlocutor to recognize that incompleteness at every juncture in the dialogue. So I think Plato agrees with you, and this is, of course, one of his main points. His point is this: we have to assume that the interlocutor has the potential for epistemic improvement. We have to assume that the interlocutor has the potential for ethical improvement. How are we going to make sense of this potential? Well, I mean, I know. All right, so two things. How are we going to make sense of it? I think firstly, Plato wants to say that it's a mystery. It's somewhat mysterious, and whenever Plato wants to indicate that something is mysterious, what does he do? He gives a myth. And he normally has Socrates indicate that it is a myth. So in the Meno, he says explicitly, well, Meno, I've heard this story from wise men and women. They're priests and priestesses. I don't really even know whether this is true, but they say that all learning is a kind of recollection. Okay, so there's something fundamentally mysterious about this. But the crucial point, I'm not saying we can't make progress. I think we could make progress specifically. If we were to take the route that Aristotle took, I think we would make more progress in the sense that we would have a metaphysic that could account for this phenomenon that you're referring to, which is in the recognition of the partiality of one's vision, one must make recourse to a deeper apprehension, which isn't, or at least hadn't been properly brought to view until one was forced to consider that question of whether one's vision was in fact partial or more satisfactory than that. So in this activity of dialogue, then we apparently have these sort of cognitive movements, sort of an apprehension of the ideal in its partiality, necessary for recognizing the partiality of one's current ethical vision. So in a way, I haven't answered your question, but I'm saying that I think Plato is content to leave it as something as a mystery, because for him the ethical dimension is most important. He thinks that you can have ethical progress only if philosophy is possible, and philosophy is possible only if, I guess, we have knowledge of ideals that we aren't fully aware of ourselves as having. Those ideals, of course, being forms. So yeah, that's pretty much the best I can do. Ashil, you may want to do a bit better than that.
I have something mysterious to add, but I'm not going to do that yet. Chad gives a thumbs up, so he likes the response. I do as well. But I am more. I'm just going to leave myself out of this. But yeah, we have Clarice, and then we have Veli. Go ahead, Clarice.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask about, if I understood correctly, to know how to act, we need to acquire virtues, and this is a continual process that will continue our whole life, and specifically the virtue of wisdom, because it underpins the other virtues. So if we, like Socrates, continually work at acquiring these virtues in the right way, I wanted to ask, is it like we're working towards one unique ideal end? So basically, if we were to complete this process, if different people were to complete it, would they all lead to the same conclusion in the sense that they would have, they would act in the same way? Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's also a very interesting question, and unfortunately, or fortunately for me, also a very difficult one. So I think we have to distinguish between two notions of wisdom. As I mentioned, I think at a certain point in my talk, Socrates is famously wise because he knows that he's not wise. Socrates is a sage because, unlike everyone else, he actually recognizes that he doesn't quite know how to live. Now, this sounds sort of strange, and I think it's actually quite difficult to recognize the truth of this, because I don't know, I think we find it difficult to recognize that we are in fact in the same position as his interlocutors. We find it very difficult to recognize that like everything his interlocutors do, which seems so silly to us, is precisely what we do. And I mean, so we kind of get lured into a false sense of security, which makes Socrates' sort of claim not to know sometimes seem a little bit silly. But now, if you recognize this distinction between true wisdom and what's sometimes called in the dialogues human wisdom. So human wisdom is the wisdom of Socrates. Socrates' wisdom is the wisdom of someone who is acutely aware of the fact that he doesn't have a proper grasp of the ethical world. He is always in the business of trying to improve his understanding. Okay, so let's work with that distinction. Now, if you accept that distinction, I think it follows that different pathways towards wisdom, or at least pathways towards improved wisdoms, if we allow that term, will be different. I don't really follow social media too much, but you know, is the term priors sometimes used? So like we all have our priors. In other words, we all begin our journey toward wisdom in as much as we undertake that journey from a slightly different place. And what that suggests then is that the specific requirements for us to improve our wisdom are going to be different. So Laches needs to do something quite different from someone who isn't concerned with courage in war, but is concerned with, say, courage in fighting injustice. Now notice that so what you're doing over here is you're trying to respond to ethical circumstances in ways that bring about a recentering of your own attention. So one of the questions that you're always asking yourself is, if I respond in this way by feeling this, for example, will this make me more partial or less partial in my vision? If I allow myself to feel this anger, will that blind me to the recognition of some other relevant considerations? So this business of self-therapy is something that's going to undertake very different pathways. For certain people who have certain preoccupations, they're going to have to do different things in order to bring themselves closer to the center. The center being something like the perspective at which you can see things without the intrusion of disorientating factors. It seems sort of circular, but I think that's in some sense the point. So then the second part of my answer to your question would be this: and what about someone who could achieve pure wisdom? And I mean, if a number of people achieve that, would they act in the same way? Well, okay, two things here. Firstly, Plato thinks it's impossible for a human being to achieve that. true wisdom is in some sense a divine accomplishment. There's something about the human condition that prevents us from attaining that level of understanding. And I think he's obviously right about that. Secondly, I mean, assuming that's not true, assuming that we could achieve true wisdom, would we act in the same way? Well, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what your question said over here, but I mean, I think the answer would be we would act in the same way in the same circumstances. So two people, assuming they were to possess wisdom, and if the circumstances in which they were not relevantly different in any way, where it's important to notice that there wouldn't be any relevant differences in themselves either. Because I mean, the reason why people sometimes have to act differently in the same circumstances because they themselves are different and they themselves are part of what's morally relevant in the situation. So the short answer to the question then is that, yeah, I mean, if you were yourself wise and someone else was wise and the circumstances were in the relevant respects identical, then the actions would be the same. But that's at least what I would want to say.
Thank you. Thanks. Clarice gives you a thumbs up. Thank you for that thoughtful question, Clarice. Veli, you have a question as well, or comment.
Thanks, Ash. Thanks very much, Dylan, for a great presentation. I, as you know, I don't know any of the stuff, so this is probably a question of ignorance rather than anything substantial. But I'll ask it anyway. Maybe it'll help clarify things. So what the supposed non-sophisticated interlocutor, that's the sophisticated one is the theorizer, right? Okay, of virtue, and then the non-sophisticated one is us. So then the conception that you at least presented seems to me both highly demanding epistemically in some ways and not demanding in other ways, not demanding enough in other ways. So it seems highly demanding because it seems to require a lot of conceptual resources, right? So the supposedly non-sophisticated interlocutor is supposed to have these concepts of virtues and ideals and so on, and be very self-reflexive and so on. So that's the sense in which it seems to me too epistemically demanding. But I guess that's Plato, so it's like not really a surprise. But then the way you describe his partial understanding seemed not demanding enough, because partial understanding was in terms of not living up to one's own ideals. But that doesn't seem to then require that you have the right ideals, right? So would full understanding require the correct bunch of ideals, or wouldn't it? And if it doesn't, then it's a bit less demanding than I would have thought. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Veli. Yeah, it's an interesting question, difficult one as well, and you might actually have to just you need to hold me to your question and make sure that I answer it. I mean, of course, I might not be able to answer it, but at least make sure that I don't answer it in the right kind of way if I don't, in fact, answer it. So yeah, right. So let me. I feel like I should take a step back very quickly, although it maybe isn't actually required in order to address what you were asking about. So in a way, we are in some sense sophisticated interlocutors, but what's interesting about us, at least on the Socratic point of view, so we have a lot of like, supposed philosophers who make appearances in the dialogues. What's interesting about them is that they have these theories, but they're disconnected from the way they live. So sort of in a weird way, the theoretician just doesn't actually live any better on account of having these theories than the ordinary interlocutor. So in a way, then the sophisticated interlocutor has an additional problem. Not only does he have a partial understanding, but he also has a theory that he can use as a weapon to prevent himself from recognizing his partial understanding. So that would be one point. Now, with regard to the epistemic demandingness, and undemandingness. So for Plato, to grow up in a human community, and I think I put up epigraph by Jung over here in my abstract, because although Socrates does talk to young people, children sometimes, sorts of conversations that I'm focusing on are very much conversations with adults. And so what Socrates has is a basic theory of ethical education, which says that, well, unless you're a psychopath, no one is wholly deluded about virtue. Just to grow up in a community is to inhabit what Plato calls the world of doxa, which is belief or partial apprehension. So we're all in this world of doxa, just because we grow up in human communities, we're not psychopaths. And so we learn things from our communities, from our parents and from our societies. So we all do have a conception of virtue. And that conception of virtue is not wholly incorrect. And furthermore, what's most interesting about the dialogue is that when we become adults, we often fail to develop further. And what that means is that we never make it past the level of community in our own understanding. And maybe this is difficult for me to elaborate on, but it's something like this. So we put ourselves forward as sort of like knowing how to live, but that means that we have a conception of virtue. But what Socrates shows is that our own conception of virtue is not being lived up to by us. And we're able to recognize that. All right, so now there's sort of a metaphysical, okay, you asked about demandingness. For Socrates, we aren't really talking about very demanding things psychologically, because what is he asking us to recognize? He's asking us to recognize things like, okay, well, can you displace your attention from the external world in specific actions and think about yourself as an originator of action? I mean, everyone can do that. Can you recognize that as an originator of action, if you only focus on your emotions and your will, you're not going to get things right always? Okay, I assume that the argument is reasonable. So you can also, most people, ordinary people, can recognize that. All right, so it seems like you need something more there. And this is part of your conception of virtue, that you need something more. And you recognize that you don't have it. And what it means for you not to have it is not to have an articulate grasp of it. But this doesn't mean that you don't have the potential at a more fundamental to develop that articulate grasp of it. And then in response to Chad's question, Socrates then wants to say, okay, well, something mysterious about us over here. If we don't get stuck at the level of community, we could make that progress, because we do have that potential, however precisely it's to be described. What is that potential? It's nothing other than the potential of bringing about the greatest conceptual understanding of our own ideals, and then regulating ourselves in light of that advanced conceptual understanding. So it works both ways. You need to already be lined up roughly correctly in order to have the conceptual understanding. But then if your conceptual understanding improves and you can line yourself up better, and then you can achieve a more advanced conceptual understanding. You kind of bootstrap yourself up towards ethical virtue. Does that help at all? Oh.
Okay, thank you for that thoughtful question, Betty. We have about 5 minutes more for questions or comments. Dylan, was there something you wanted to speak about in this talk that you thought might be essential, but you didn't have time to do that? Now you have some time to bring that in if you want to.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I want to say too much more. I mean, it's extremely difficult, because I mean, as mentioned, question, what is wisdom? Right. So I mean, my answer is, in some sense, well, you kind of have to be wise to know what wisdom is. pretty much where I'm getting to, where I was aiming for. Now, so the various problems over here, which have to do with. Okay, so I think I could just blunder my way through, but for 2 minutes. I think when one thinks about something like practical wisdom, when you think about, okay, what do I need in order to act well? Maybe the temptation for us is to refer to something like ethical theory. So we say something like, oh, maybe ruled utilitarianism, or maybe a more sophisticated version of Kant. Something like that. If we had that theory in our grasp, we could then regulate ourselves in terms of that theory. So the position that I'm trying to present here, which is obviously, I'm aiming to say that it comes from Socrates, but I also think it moves into Aristotle, is precisely the kind of the opposite of that. It's saying that, well, you have to start with the small things. You need to recognize that practical wisdom is really nothing other than a state of non-interference of distorting elements. So this definitely leads you into the domain of things like Stoicism. So it leads you into the domain of saying things like, well, you can't really have emotions, because to be in the grip of an emotion is nothing other than to focus on something as of greater significance than other stuff which may in fact be relevant. So it feels like, you get to this conclusion where, well, even if you were in a position where you thought to yourself, okay, should I be angry about this? Would my being angry be distorting or illuminating? Even that might be too much anger. So it becomes quite a difficult question about, shall we say, the proper regulation of emotion by practical wisdom. To what extent emotions themselves might have to be sort of subsumed into the sort of discursive, wisdom-loving element of the psyche. And I think that's pretty much, anyway, so those are some problems that I see for myself down the line. And every reasonable philosopher has to end a talk with a bunch of problems that haven't been answered.
A cliffhanger. Yes. What would a talk in philosophy be without a cliffhanger? Wait for season 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
well,
I wanted to. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna run with you. That story of Wittgenstein. He wrote the Tractatus, and then he thought, oh, okay, I've solved all the problems in philosophy. Let me go off and become a gardener. So my suggestion is, that isn't a good way to end a philosophical book.
Okay, so I hope we don't see you in 15 years. So I just wanted to add briefly, because I'm not a scholar of ancient Greek philosophy like you are, but I do have a keen interest in this in the ancient world, not just the ancient Greek world. It's interesting to me to see how very similar ideas sprouted up in different parts of the world at the same time. When you were speaking, I was reminded of the idea of self-unfoldment in ancient Indian philosophy. So the idea is that you have the knowledge, you have wisdoms, I should say. You have wisdom inside you, or not inside you, quote unquote. And what happens with proper, let's use the word you used, with the proper practice, it can unfold. So I'm literally looking at a book right now that says self-unfoldment. It's from that tradition. It sounds similar to what I think Socrates might be trying to do, but I can't be sure. But there's a thing about self-unfoldment, is that it has a very particular set of metaphysical assumptions. One of the things it assumes is that you cannot come to know the ultimate nature of reality through the intellect alone. So like you see, I guess later in Plato, there was a division of the mind in terms of, I'm not going to go through it, but one intellect is just one part of the mind. The idea is that you can't get to this ultimate knowledge using the intellect alone. Once you mine it using other parts of your mind, and then you can use your intellect to sharpen it. So maybe in a sense that's what you're getting at here through the Socratic dialogue. The questions are, urging the interlocutor to think with other parts of their being, and then bring that out, and then maybe the intellect can work to refine what's going on there. But first, it has to come from the other parts of the interlocutor's being. I was also thinking about the idea of the ontic logos, which you didn't mention, but I suspect that it's part of your thinking, and I suggest that perhaps the best way to understand what's going on with Socrates, people like Socrates and Plato, is that they had these metaphysical assumptions, and they actually lived in the world a different way to which we as, say, atheistic materialists live in the world. We're different. It's a different kind of being. Right? It's not just a different epistemic framework. It's a different. They're different sorts of beings. And we can become those sorts of beings. Maybe becoming that sort of being that Socrates was or Plato was is getting closer to a wise being. But the suggestion is that it's not just the intellect that's going to get us there. Not my suggestion. It's a suggestion that I've seen in what I think I see in Plato and what I think I see in other parts of the ancient world. We're out of time, and I don't want to give myself the last word, so I'm going to give you the last word. You have I don't know, a minute to say something brilliant.
Yes. Oh dear. It just went out of my head. So yeah, I thank you for those references. I would actually be grateful if I could. I'll make contact with you by email, maybe, because I think your concept of unfolding is precisely what I'm trying to talk about. And it wouldn't be that surprising if there were affinities between the Indian and the Greek traditions. Of course, there was a lot of overlap, especially in Anatolia, and like people like Heraclitus certainly influenced Socrates and Plato, and seem to have been influenced by the Indian traditions, the Vedas perhaps. So in this regard, yeah, I'm sympathetic to that part of the question. And now I know that I'm running out of time, so I certainly don't want to keep anyone. And so let me just think about what I want to say by way of conclusion. I think I'm not going to respond to your points about knowing through other parts of the soul. I think that's incorrect for Plato, although I think that he thinks that the epistemic part of the soul, so to speak, has different capacities. But I think for him, desire always has to in some sense follow reason. I'm not going to argue for that. The last point that I would make is this. In Socrates, Aristotle famously says that Socrates wasn't a metaphysician. He was an ethicist. And one way to understand the difference between Plato and Socrates is that Plato thought that you had to do metaphysics in order to make sense of how Socratic education was possible. So I would want to say that it's maybe incorrect, in my opinion, to say that Plato is a metaphysician. I don't think he's driven by his metaphysical commitments. I think his metaphysical commitments are, in some sense, sort of presented as sort of presuppositions of the kinds of ethical deformations and formations that he thinks that we would all recognize to be possible. So there might be potentially a slight discrepancy there in sort of the relationship between the metaphysical and the ethical branches of philosophy.
Thank you. I'm going to invite everyone to thank the speaker, our speaker today, with reactions, namely the hand clap function. Veli leads the way. I shall give one as well. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk and for helping us think through these ancient but still relevant ideas.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for hosting me. Yeah, you guys have been a great audience, so give yourselves a pat on the back, and hopefully I'll see you in the flesh sometime.
Yes, not after 15 years, but
yeah,
soon. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye.